I'm Professor Hal. Today's lecture is on making PowerPoints, specifically how to lay out your slides better. The material is based off the book Presentations End by Gar Reynolds. Many of you have seen Shark Tank, know what that is. The people on Shark Tank are what are known as venture capitalists. This gentleman, Guy Kawasaki, is also a venture capitalist. He spends a lot of time listening to presentations. Because of that, he has come up with what he's called his 10-20-30 rule. First rule is no more than 10 slides. For our purposes, you can figure a good rule of thumb is about 30 seconds per slide. If you tend to spend more than 1 minute on a slide, people start thinking that you just forgot to advance the slides. So when you're making your presentation, think about the number of slides you're putting in and don't inundate us with like 3,000 slides. The next one is no longer than 20 minutes. In his video, he talks about this, says you may have an hour for a presentation, but the reality of it is it's going to take you 40 minutes to get your computer to work with the projector. Very few people, with the exception of speech professors, are going to complain if your speech or your presentation is short. Most people would prefer short, sweet, and to the point. Winston Churchill once said that a speech is like a woman's skirt. It should be long enough to cover the material, but short enough to still be interesting. Be concise, be clear, but make sure that you meet the requirements of the time that you have when you're doing it for a grade. And the last thing he has is no less than 30-point font. He has two rules for this, reasons for this rule. The first one is that you're probably got to be able to see the font at the back of the room. But the other reason is to make sure that you don't put way too much information on your font, or on your slide rather. His rule of thumb is take the age of the oldest person in the room, divide that in half, and that's the minimum font size. So let's talk about text and font while we're looking at it. Fonts do matter. There is a big difference. There is a very significant difference between I will always find you and I will always find you. I don't know which one's worse. So be aware of what font you're using. There are three basic types of fonts that you're going to deal with. The first one is a serif font. Serifs are these little hang-down things that you find in Times New Roman, Garment, and Century School Book. It's the little extra bits and pieces that are on the font itself. Those little bits help your eye travel along the line of a font or along the line of text. So if you have a book or a large block of text that you're writing, serif fonts help the reader follow along with you. The next one is sans serif or without serif. As you can see, those fonts here do not have the little tab thingies like the other ones do. They don't have serifs. It's without serif. Serif fonts are really good for small chunks of text, just a little bit here and there. They're also really good if what you're writing has to be used with a visual e-reader, because the serifs in the serif fonts creates visual clutter that makes it difficult to read. The third type of font are novelty fonts. There are a whole bunch of these kind of fonts out there. You have to be careful with it, especially if you are using Comic Sans. I don't know why the internet has such a bad feel for Comic Sans, but you could write the most profound statement ever of human history, and if you did it in Comic Sans, all they're going to do is bash Comic Sans. It's fine to make headings in some novelty fonts. If you find something good, try to avoid the really complex ones like Old English or various scripts like Brush Script, or the ones that say like Bradley Hand or something that are really difficult to read. Okay, so now that you've figured out what font you're going to use, we're going to have to talk about font sizes. Remember the guy's 10-20-30 rule? He said no less than 30-point font. Well, when you're making your font, remember that you're putting it up in the front of a screen when you're making your thing, and it's got to be a certain size. Just because you can easily see a 12-point font on your computer screen doesn't mean that someone's going to be able to see it from the back of the room. So let's walk through some of these fonts. This is how big a 54-point font is. When you're in a classroom, that's still a pretty good size thing. And we'll work through 40 and 32 and 24. Really, that is about the smallest that you want to put on your slide. If you go less than 24, you're probably putting way too much information on the slide. So let's go on. So we got 24, you get down to 18, 16, 12, 10, 8, and even that. Right now, you can probably still read what it says on that slide. on the bottom. The downfall is if you were sitting in the back of a classroom, that is microscopic. It's very, very tiny. All right, so you know what font you're going to use. You're going to figure out the size. And as you're writing, you're going to stop and think about how are you going to punctuate? How are you going to do capitalization? Are you going to use basically normal punctuation and capitalization? For example, hello, I am Tim Howell, your instructor for this class. The commas are where they belong, the periods where it belongs, first letter, I, proper nouns, all capitalized. But you also have the ones that do all caps, and that's when you're yelling, right? Well, a lot of people think that looks better, but it really doesn't. It's harder to read. Of course, the inverse of that is no capitalization. And a lot of y'all get that with no caps, but you still got punctuation here, so at least you can tell that. But the problem is you also run into the no punctuation. Punctuation does matter, and it makes things more difficult to read. And when you have no capitalization or punctuation, it really becomes difficult. And the funny thing is the people that write with this online, and particularly if they're using their phone, have had to go through and change the settings in their phone to not change the first letter and the capital I and all those. They actually had to work for this. Okay, so, but does it really matter? Yes, punctuation really does matter. There is a significant difference between let's eat kitty and let's eat kitty. Okay, I have a survey blog. On my blog, I get comments on various things. This was an actual comment from someone who posted. As you can see, there's a few random capitalizations in there. There's a few periods and commas, but I think they're only to do with money or dollar figures or numbers. I don't really see any other punctuation. Some things get there, but if you try to read this, if you want to take the time and go read this PowerPoint, you can pause it and read this thing. It's horrid. My best guess is it is a voice to text, and the person that submitted it never bothered to go back and reread. Okay, so if you want to take time, pause it. I'll wait. Okay, so you've read it. It's bad. All right. My next slide is I'm going to present it like I was presenting for a class. Not as talking about the slide, but as talking about the content of the slide. And then we'll talk about it. So, there are 4 types of mediation. The first one is facilitative mediating. Facilitative mediation is where the mediator functions as a person to help the 2 parties resolve their dispute. They are all about the process. They control the process. What they don't do is deal with the content itself. The content is chosen by the parties. The facilitated mediator does that. The next one is evaluative. And now let's stop and think. Did you read ahead? There's a high likelihood you probably did. You probably could tell me what all 4 of those narrative, the facilitative, narrative, evaluative, transformative, narrative model, all the mediation types are. If you didn't, somebody would eventually. So when you are doing slides, when you are doing these, think about using animations. Think about how it should look. You should not put all of your text up at once. You should come up and say, there are 4 basic types of mediation. The first type of mediation is facilitative models of mediation. It's a chance for you to work and you will talk through it, then the mediation and all that. Do not put all your text at once. Do it in chunks. Do not put a lot of text. If you'll notice, all I have on here is the word facilitative, evaluative, transformative, and narrative. I do not go in and talk about all of the data. I just give you the words so they can write it down. So let's go back here. Here's one of the things I have seen that happens. Somebody will do animations. They'll prepare their slides. They'll have all the animations. They'll pop up and they'll say, okay, so there's 4 types of mediation. And then they'll punch them all in and then they'll go talk about it. It did absolutely no purpose for this, so you need to pay attention. So try to use animations. I know many of you have probably done PowerPoints and you've probably used transitions, going from one slide to the next. When I first made a PowerPoint, my very first PowerPoint I ever made, I got really creative on the transitions. And what happened is that as I was going, I ended up doing something like this. So we've got these transmission sides and you're looking at this and you see how long it takes to transition. So think about that in the future when you're doing your transitions. Make sure that you look at them, walk through your slide, do a test run with your PowerPoint to make sure that you're not standing there twiddling your thumbs waiting for your animations to do what they need to do. All right, now let's look at images. Images is a chance for you all to, or is it's not really a chance. Imagery actually helps with delivering your content. They say that a person who hears a piece of information only, and 3 days later, you'll only remember about 10% of it. Okay, but the reality of it is, if you do visual, if you see something, you're going to probably remember 35% of it. And they're claiming that if you have both oral and visual, you're upwards of 65% of it, or you're going to remember 6 times as much as if you were just told alone. So for your presentation, for a PowerPoint, use lots of imagery. It does not have to be exactly linked to what you're talking about, but it is useful. Okay, so let's look at some image stuff and let's talk about that. We're going to look at 2 slides here. Let's look at this first slide. How does this look? We got some good contrast up here in the lettering. That's a pretty image. It helps us look at things. Now, but could it be better? Yes, it could. This looks much better. This is called full bleed. You're running that image all the way to the edge. So you got to make sure that you have an image that's big enough, but you can put your image up there and you put your text. A little cautionary tale on this. When I made this slide, the first thing I did was I just created text. Well, PowerPoint will default to probably a white text, depending on what theme you're using. The problem is, if you have a white text on this, it is very bright. It is too high of contrast. It looks bad. So I changed it to black. The downfall was that it was sitting over here lined up to the left. So like a whole chunk of this was unreadable. I had to pull it over. So make sure that you're aware of this when you're looking at these things. Next one, what do we think is wrong with this slide? Yeah, I know, too much to count. First off, you go look and the title's not very stark, but the biggest thing, the very first thing you see is the background image. It is pixelated. Someone took a little thumbnail and stretched it out big enough to cover the full background. At least they used it as a full background, but they stretched it out. And then they've got a lot of text up here, and it all comes up at once. A shark must keep moving a die. A blog must be regularly updated. How often should you update your blogs? Some successful blogs, etc. You get the feel for that. None of that actually needed to be on the slide. This is a presentation. You're talking, so you should have just spoke through this. I do want to point out down here at the bottom, it says May 12, 2007. It came from the Blog Like a Pro conference of 07. Somebody actually got in front of somebody, a group of people, with this slide and thought they'd made a good slide. So let's look at this again. Which is better, the first slide that we're looking at or the next slide? Yeah, it's this slide. The reality of it is as you're looking at it, I can put blogs are like sharks, and then I can go through and talk through all of the little bits and pieces that they would have had in there, in opposed to trying to put it all on the screen. Too much text on a screen means people read and they don't listen to you. It also means, and I'm sure you've had this happen before, you're sitting there watching a PowerPoint presentation from someone and they're just reading the slides to you. So let's look at the next thing, and this is just a slide showing how bad things can be. There is a lot of text on this slide. I mean, they put way too much information. But then, you know, to be nice, they decided to put an image on here. Well, over here on the image, you've even got overlap where the text runs into the image. The picture is way too small. Sure, it's relevant to refugees, but it's not really useful on this process. So let's just drop that one and move on. Okay, so you know, don't put a lot of text. Images are better than text. In fact, a lot of imagery, little text is even better. Now, I'm not going to go into the rule of thirds. I probably don't know the rule of thirds well enough specifically. I do know that as a cartographer and as doing graphic imagery like that, I understand that the human brain doesn't like symmetry so much. They don't really lean towards centering and alignment and all that stuff. So the rule of thirds has the notion that you're going to lay things out on this grid instead of centered and aligned. So if we look at this image, you've got the image shoved over here on the right third, giving you some information on that, and then the text is up here on the top third. That is a fairly eye-appealing image. It does what you need to do without looking weird, without feeling kind of funny in your mind. Here's another one, same thing. The focal point is the woman walking or jogging, and then of course the text that goes along with it. You still have a nice big background image and all that stuff. If you're not aware of this, most phones allow you to actually set this grid so you can align your stuff a little bit differently, so when you take pictures, you can get a more visually appealing picture. So when you're laying out your slides, don't just automatically align everything one way. Lay it out, look at it, move them around, get what looks good to you, not as much what is perfectly in centered and sync. Now, when you're throwing images onto a slide, you can have a bunch of individual images and they can look like this as a bunch of chunky images blocked out. If you're lucky, you have like this one and they all have the same color background. Sometimes you don't, not so lucky. If you can pull it off, or if you have Photoshop or GIMP 2, which is Graphic Image Manipulation Program 2, which is a free software, you can change the background images or you can delete them and make transparent images. But either way, if you take a few minutes to make it match, you might come out with something that looks a lot cleaner and better than the previous blocked out. It looks like I actually tried to do something instead of just throwing it on there. We have the same issue when you come up with this. There's nothing really tremendously wrong with this slide. It works. I'm just not a big fan of, I've got a solid background and now I have an image with a frame that looks kind of weird looking, and then I've got, text and it's just kind of shoved up there at the top. We can look at this one and see that now that we have a bigger image, it blends with the background so it looks like the fish is just swimming on the page instead of being chunked in the corner. And then of course the text is big enough to read. So let's move on to the next slide and let's look at this. This one is, sorry, I was being lazy, it's a scan from the book. But as you can see, the slides are basically the same with the exception of the woman. In this slide, she's looking at the numbers, and this slide, she's just looking off into who knows where. Take just a second to look at your slides and think about it. And the reason why I bring this up is that, like the fish, let's go back to the fish. On the first slide, the fish is looking off to the right. On the next slide, the fish is basically looking up towards the text. On PowerPoint, you can just grab a grip corner, drag it, and it'll reverse that image for you. So when you post an image, think about it and think of which way that person is looking, if there's a person or an animal or a creature in there, and see if it's paying attention. But at the same token, it matters what you're talking about. For example, in these slides, in the first slide, you see gender issues in Japan, and they're looking at it. That seems logical. It should be the best one, right? However, what about if I'm talking about the future of gender issues in Japan? Then I have this subtle idea that they're looking off into the future. What is it going to look like? So there can be some symbology within your symbols that you're using. Think about it and try to work those things through. And finally, we're going to talk about white space, but I'm also going to talk about this specifically, but white space as well. This slide has a lot of information on it. Again, way too much. There's a high likelihood someone's going to sit there and read this to you or read close to what's in it. We could take this one slide, and now we can break this slide into 3 separate slides and have a lot better walkthrough. So I'm going to bring up the first slide and I'm going to introduce you to the text. I'm going to tell you this is Hare Hachibu, or however you pronounce it. And it's the concept or notion of only eating till you're 80% full. So when you're looking at that, you're only going to eat 80% of what, to your stomach's only 80% full instead of being stuffed. So you're going to walk through all that information and then you're going to give this other one showing the little 20%. What that does is that gives that imagery and that re-emphasis of the stuff, but everything's not covered. Okay, so we broke the slide down and we got rid of all that text. Now let's go back and look. Here we have top third, right third, lots of white space, various stuff that's not being utilized. Here we have a lot of extra white space around. And we have even more white space now that we got rid of the sushi. So don't be afraid to have some white space. You do not have to cover everything 100%. When you look at things, sometimes less is more. You can have a little bit of imagery. It will build things up. You can have a little bit of text. If you're putting a quote, obviously you have to spell out the quote, but you don't technically have to have text on it. You can just have images. So take a bit, take some time, work out your slides, go through it after the fact, walk through your speech to make sure that your slides work the way you want them to, and have some fun with it. Make it yours. Have some ownership. Have some pride in it. Make it pretty.